I'm happy to introduce Dr. Jason Dahl from the University of Rhode Island's Ocean Engineering Department. He studied at MIT in ocean engineering, and before then he got his BS in naval architecture and marine engineering at the Webb Institute on Long Island. His research interests include fluid structure interactions and floating body dynamics, as well as biomimetic sensing, artificial intelligence in ocean engineering applications, and ocean renewable energy. A lot of his work is experimental, but I know he also assists with a lot of CFD work. And he works alongside numerous marine renewable companies such as Navitec with joint projects connecting academia to industry. And on a personal note, I know he's one of the best lecturers I've had in my education. So without further ado, here's Jason and his talk.
All right, so as Matt had mentioned, my name is Jason Dahl. I'm from the Ocean Engineering Department at the University of Rhode Island. And today I want to talk a little bit about a topic that I've been spending a lot of time with over probably 20 years now, the topic of vortex-induced vibrations. I do want to acknowledge Erdem Atkinson and Dennis Gedikli, who were both former PhD students of mine. Erdem's now at the University of New Orleans as a postdoc, and Dennis is a faculty member and assistant professor at the University of Hawaii now. But both of them contributed to this work, so I just want to acknowledge them.
Jason, we can see your presenter view instead of full screen at present.
Okay.
If you click on swap displays, you get the correct one.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I'm assuming that with the group, now my, okay, this was working before. All right, I'm assuming that the group here in working in renewable energy systems or energy systems in general, you may or may not be familiar with the topic of vortex-induced vibrations. It's not necessarily specific to renewable energy systems, but it is related in some way, and it's important to structures that operate in the ocean. So just to give you an idea of what vortex-induced vibrations are, if you have fluid flowing across a bluff-shaped body that's flexible in nature, the vortex shedding behind that body can cause it to vibrate. So this is an example of a flexible cylinder encountering a fluid flow. The fluid flow is flowing out of the screen towards your face, which is causing this cylinder to then vibrate due to that fluid structure interaction. Now, this is an issue in a lot of ocean systems. So in offshore structures, such as the spar buoy platform that's over on the right here, this thing itself is a large cylinder that floats in the ocean. So if it encounters currents, the whole structure itself may vibrate due to the presence of those currents. It also has mooring lines, which can strum due to the presence of those currents. It also has drilling risers. Those can vibrate due to currents, which can cause problems with the operation of offshore structures like this. It's also an issue for energy systems in the ocean. So floating offshore wind has mooring systems, has cylindrical shapes if they're floating structures. So a spar type floating offshore wind system may be susceptible to these types of vibrations. Electrical cables, underwater electrical cables could encounter these types of things. Towed systems, also towed arrays can also undergo strumming that can cause a problem with imaging underwater. And then in the upper left here, this is actually a picture of a device called Vivace, developed at the University of Michigan, which tries to utilize the vibrations caused by vortex-induced vibrations for actually energy harvesting purposes. So they have an array of 4 cylinders here that vibrate when this device is placed in a current. So today, although there's a variety of these applications that are relevant to this topic, today I'm going to talk about things at a much more fundamental level and not so much in terms of the applications. So just to give an outline of what I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about some basic simplifications for modeling vortex-induced vibrations, how we simplify these more complex applied problems into something more canonical. Talk about forced motions experiments, which is one way that we use for understanding the forces that act on the structure under these types of flow conditions. And then some of the observations from these forced motions experiments, which include looking at the forces, which can involve some very nonlinear behaviors, such as multiple branches or multiple wakes for a given set of kinematic conditions, and looking at wake modes. So looking at some flow visualization of what's actually happening in the fluid when these structures vibrate. So just to give an outline of or basic understanding of this problem, if we've got some floating structure here, which might be this green box, and then some long flexible structure stretching to the bottom. This could be a drilling riser, it could be a mooring line, it could be whatever. These types of structures in the ocean might encounter a sheared current. So it might encounter it could be a uniform current. It could be a current that changes with depth. But locally, what's happening is if we look at a cross section of this structure, we can think of it as though we've got some cylinder here. That cylinder is flexible in some way. If we're just looking at a cross section of the structure, we might think of it as just a cylinder with a spring attached to it, or a spring damper combination attached to it. And as fluid flows across that cylinder, we get vortices that shed in the wake of the structure. And the phasing and proximity and strength of those vortices can force this structure then to move side to side, which cause it to vibrate. Now, if we want to think about the similar problem, or the simplified problem, we consider just a uniform incoming current flowing across the cylinder. As the fluid flows across the cylinder, you get these vortices shedding in the wake. The proximity and motion of those vortices to the cylinder cause a force to act on the cylinder. One other way you can think of this is like these vortices are little low pressure regions in the wake of the body. And so the body will get pulled towards them. Now, when this happens, if you notice, the cylinder, or when you have vortices shed in the wake of this cylinder, the typical shedding pattern may be to have one shedding to one side and an opposite rotating vortex shedding to the other side. As this happens, the vortex on top will pull the cylinder upward. The vortex on the bottom will force the cylinder downward. So you get a frequency associated with the forcing of shedding. And the frequency acting in the y direction occurs at the same frequency at which a single vortex sheds. But if you think about the drag direction, so the force acting in the x direction, it'll happen at twice that frequency. And that's because the vortices are always shedding to the same side of the cylinder. They're always shedding downstream. So you end up typically, when you have this type of vortex shedding in the wake of an object, it has a 2-to-1 frequency ratio. That becomes important when you start thinking about, or when we start looking at what can happen on these types of structures in more complex situations. And then when we consider what's happening with this structure, we need it to be flexibly mounted in order for it to move. And so if we just consider maybe this 2D structure then is mounted on springs, the most simple case that we might consider is that the structure is only allowed to move in the y direction. That's an assumption that's commonly made in offshore structures. And the reason is that most of the vibrations that are observed for these types of structures occur in the y direction. They occur in what's called the cross flow direction, or perpendicular to the direction of the flow. Whereas vibrations in the x direction end up being much smaller. But that type of simplification can cause a problem. But let's first look at the simplest condition. So if we consider only motion of our structure in the y direction, one of the common assumptions to make is to assume only sinusoidal motions and forces. Now, this is a big assumption. It's not actually true. If you observe the vibrations of a structure undergoing these types of this type of excitation, it doesn't just vibrate with sinusoidal type motions, and it certainly doesn't just have sinusoidal forces. But this is a simplification that's made to help understand the problem a little more. So if we do that, we can define an equation of motion. So for our simplified case, it just looks like a simple spring mass dashpot system with a mass in the y direction, a damping in the y direction, and a spring constant for the y direction. And then the fluid force is all on the right-hand side of the equation. So this is the forcing caused by the presence of and shedding of those vortices. If we assume sinusoidal motion, we can assume a form of the response. So the response has some amplitude and frequency. We can derive the derivatives then from that response. If we also assume that the forcing is a sinusoidal response, we said that this is not entirely true. This is actually like a first order approximation of the force if we treated the force as though it were a Fourier series. Then we can say that the force is of the form of some magnitude occurring at the same frequency with some phase shift. If in that case, we can then decompose the force into a cosine and sine term, which end up being a force in phase with acceleration, which we call FAY here, the force in phase with acceleration, and the force in phase with the velocity. Now, if we have a force in phase with acceleration in this linear system here, we can actually represent that as being some mass times the acceleration of the body. We call this mass an added mass force. In this case, this is not your typical potential flow added mass force. It's a force that's caused by forces from vortex shedding that just happen to be in phase with the acceleration of the body. So this is actually a force where it could be the mass, this added mass could be positive or negative. So if the force in phase with acceleration is pushing in the direction of motion of the body, then the added mass is actually negative. If it's opposing the motion of the body, then it's a positive added mass. Similarly, we could define an added damping or an excitation force, which is associated with our force in phase with velocity. So when we do that, we can substitute these forces into our equation, and we write our equation, which looks something like a damped free vibration of a 1 degree of freedom spring mass dashpot. And you might say, oh, well, that's a simple equation that has an analytic solution to it. But the problem here is that the mass, this added mass and this added damping term, which come from the force in phase with acceleration and the force in phase with velocity, those are motion dependent. They're dependent on time. They're dependent on the response in the y direction. If we also have motion in the x direction, it's dependent on the motion in the x direction. So these are time-dependent coefficients that are constantly changing in time. So you cannot solve this equation analytically, and you need some expression or some representation of these fluid forces in order to be able to solve this equation. Similar, or we also, if we end up normalizing this equation, we normalize these terms. So the added mass ends up being normalized as a mass coefficient. The force in phase with velocity is normalized as a lift coefficient in phase with velocity, which is denoted as CLV. And the force in phase with acceleration may be normalized as a lift coefficient in phase with acceleration, which is denoted as CLA. So we can solve this equation iteratively if we know the added mass coefficient and we know the lift in phase with velocity, because that way we could update these terms in time. So how do we determine those? Well, one of the ways, there's a variety of ways that people approach for determining these. You might use a fluid model similar looking to the Morrison equation, for example. There's a lot of work that's been done on what are called wake oscillators for trying to model this. But those approaches are, they are somewhat flawed in the fact that they don't perfectly capture what's happening in the fluid when it's responding to what the structural system is doing. So one approach to solving or to representing the fluid force is to conduct forced motion experiments. So in this case, what we do is we take our cylinder and we force it with a prescribed motion. So our prescribed motion here might be a sinusoidal motion, as I have here, y is equal to a cosine omega t. And then we say that the output force, again, we'll assume that it's of the form of some sinusoid with the same frequency and a phase shift. So then if we go through prescribing a bunch of motions, do a number of experiments where we force this cylinder to oscillate with a varying amplitude or varying frequency, then we can come up with basically a database or a lookup table of forces that we can use as an input to solving our equation of motion. Now, in simplifying the problem, I'm ending up with this very simple looking equation of motion. Now, if we wanted to do this for a much more complicated structure, such as a riser that's running from the surface of the ocean to the ocean floor, or a mooring line or whatnot, then we would just substitute our equation here with the appropriate equation of motion for that system. So it might be a tensioned beam or whatnot. The other thing we can say is that from a system like this, we know that if this is a damped oscillator, well, the damping goes away when this condition, the structural damping and the excitation from the fluid force, cancel one another. Whoops, didn't want to go that. So when they cancel one another, these two terms go to zero. This velocity term then goes away. And what you're left with is a freely vibrating system. And basically you can think of this as a system that's going to oscillate at its effective natural frequency. In this case, the effective natural frequency of this system would just be the square root of ky over m plus ma. All right. It's not really a free vibration. It's actually a forced vibration system because it's being excited by the fluid, but it behaves like a freely vibrating system with a natural frequency. Now, in the forced motion work, there's been a number of studies that have been done to study this, to develop fluid force models for these types of systems. One of the most expansive databases was done by Morse and Williamson. It's reported in a Journal of Fluid Mechanics paper from 2009, where they did cross-flow only motion experiments where they varied the non-dimensional amplitude and the non-dimensional frequency. Non-dimensional frequency is represented by this term VR, which is called the reduced velocity. And they did a very fine experimental resolution set. So they took these parameters and they varied them by very small amounts. So they ended up doing a total of 5,680 experiments. Now they conducted these experiments by taking their cylinder and putting it in a recirculating flow channel, and then they would oscillate the cylinder with these different amplitudes and frequencies, and then they'd run an experiment for maybe a minute or so, collect data, then vary the parameter and do that again to collect a new set of data. It took a long time to be able to run this many experiments, but they ended up with a really fine mapping of how these fluid forces change as a function of these parameters. So on this graph, the non-dimensional amplitude is the vertical axis, and the non-dimensional frequency is the horizontal axis. The other thing that they noted, they looked at what was happening in the wake of the structure, and they saw that for different conditions, different kinematic conditions, you observe different types of wakes. So these wakes might be categorized as what's called 2S. 2S is when you have two single vortices shed per cycle of motion. Sometimes this is what's called the von Karman vortex street, where you have just alternating patterns of counter-rotating vortices. They also noticed conditions where you can have a 2P wake. That's when you have two pairs of counter-rotating vortices that shed per cycle. And then there are also asymmetric wake conditions, which are like when you have really high frequencies and really high amplitudes. You can get asymmetric wakes like P plus S, which is where you have a pair plus a single vortex that shed every cycle. One of the interesting things they noted was there were certain regions, certain kinematic conditions where you could observe multiple types of wakes. So where this red area is in the center here, they observed conditions where you could see a 2P wake, or you could also see a 2S wake, depending on their particular experiment, which direction they were approaching things from. So if they were increasing frequency, for example, they might go from having a 2S wake to a 2P wake here. Whereas if they were decreasing frequency, they might go from a 2P wake to a 2P0 wake instead of switching to a 2S wake. And so this was interesting in the fact that you have it's a nonlinear response in the wake where you can have multiple possible wakes for the same kinematic motions of the system. But it was only observed for a small area here. Now, one of the problems with making these simplifications of only looking at cross-flow motion is that on real structures move with three-dimensional vibrations. They move all over the place. And so if you want to look at a cross-section of one of these structures, it's really more accurate to consider that the cross-section of the structure can move in both the X and Y direction, which is how I had introduced the problem originally. And when that happens, if we look at what the structure is doing in that cross-sectional plane, you can get all of these interesting types of motions because of that 2-to-1 ratio between inline and cross-flow forcing that we said is a natural aspect of vortex shedding. You end up with the structure being excited with these figure-8 type motions. And when you have these figure-8 type motions, it changes the relative motion of the body relative to those vortices being shed in the wake, which then affects how the forces act on the structure. And it completely changes the forcing on the structure. So you can end up with conditions where, for example, even though the structure is moving with a sinusoidal type motion, so on the bottom right here, this is the Y motion of one of these cylinders vibrating, the force might not occur at the same frequency. So here we can see that actually there's a dominant third harmonic force acting on the structure in the lift direction or in the Y direction. That's what's illustrated by these contours in the background of this plot on the left, where there's yellow. that's where there's a really, really strong third harmonic force that acts on the structure. So this is actually important because higher frequency forcing can really affect fatigue life of things that are undergoing these types of vibrations. All right, so if it's important to consider that our structure can move with both cross flow and inline motion, then we have a different set of equations. So then we might introduce a second equation to describe motion in the x direction. In our simplified system of just a cylinder with spring masses, our equations might look something like this, where again, Fy and Fx are now the oscillatory or fluctuating fluid forces in both the x and y directions. And again, if we want to solve this system of equations and predict how a structure might move under certain incoming flow conditions, what we need is some sort of model to represent or to determine what these fluid forces are. So again, we could take this forced motion approach. In this case, if we describe forced motions of our structure in both x and y, we can define a sinusoidal motion in y and a sinusoidal motion in x. And in this case, if we want to capture these kinematics where we have like a figure-8 type motion, we can introduce a phase, theta, which is a phase between x and y motion, between motions in the x and y direction. And as we vary that phase, we actually end up with different orbital trajectories of our cylinder, which are illustrated in the upper right here. These orbital trajectories, it's actually interesting. Aren't words in the English language to describe the directionality of figure-8s. So if you notice, a figure-8 with 0-degree phase is moving such that it's moving to the left on the upper side and the lower side of the figure-8 motion. Whereas if it's a minus 180 degrees, it's moving in the opposite direction. It's moving to the right. Because of that, we defined motions where if the fluid flow is left to right, if on the top of the figure-8, it's moving in a counterclockwise direction, we just call that counterclockwise. And if it's moving in a clockwise direction, as it is for minus 180 degrees, we call that clockwise. It's not a great definition, but it works okay as long as you know what it means. So that means that everything in the upper quadrant, or sorry, the upper half of this polar plot here is what we would call counterclockwise motion. And everything in the lower half of the polar plot would be called clockwise motion. When we do this parameterization of the forces and we define these forced motions in x and y, we end up with now 4 non-dimensional parameters that can describe the motion of our body. So a non-dimensional amplitude in y, a non-dimensional amplitude in x, a reduced velocity. There's only one reduced velocity because there's a fixed frequency relation between x and y. And then theta, which is the phase between these two motions and determines this orbital shape. All right, so if we want to run a set of forced motion experiments, we need to vary all of these parameters. But one problem is that in comparison with, for instance, Morse and Williamson, which we showed earlier, in that case, because they were only forcing the body to move perpendicular to the flow direction, they only had 2 parameters. So they ran, thousands of runs over these 2 parameters, which gave them a really high resolution of experiments. Now, if I want to achieve the same resolution of experiments, if we say, take the square root of 5,680, that gives you a rough parameter resolution of about 75. If I want the same resolution where I've doubled the number of parameters, now I have 4 parameters that I'm varying, that means I need to run about 32 million experiments, which that's not going to happen. So we definitely cannot run. That would take years and years and years to do something like that. There have been other, less resolved forced motion studies. So for instance, Gopal-Krishnan in 1994 did a set of about 300 runs. But still, even in that case, the equivalent number of runs I would have to do if I'm increase my parameters to 4 is over 90,000 runs. So it becomes difficult to be able to get a really high resolution measurement of the force in this way. Now, we kind of move ahead with doing this anyway, but we've actually been a little bit clever about it by understanding a little bit more about the physics. So in the current set of experiments that I want to present today, we end up doing about 10,000 experiments where we're varying these 4 parameters, which gives us a resolution close to about 10. But where we make the resolution, where we really increase the resolution or have a high resolution is in variation of the reduced velocity VR and variation in phase. And we actually leave the variation of amplitudes relatively coarse. So we end up doing amplitudes between 0.1 and 1.6, varying by 0.25. We do amplitudes in the x direction with a spacing of 0.1 between 0.1 and 0.5. Reduced velocity, we vary by 0.2 between 4 and 8, which gives us a higher resolution of reduced velocity. And then we go through a full range of theta, varying it by 30 degrees. All right, the way that we conduct these experiments, we have a small towing tank that has a carriage. It's a completely motorized robotic system. So our carriage is mounted to a motor that drives the carriage forward with some speed u. On the carriage, we have an XY motion system that can force the test cylinder to move with our prescribed motions in the X and Y directions. So as we tow the cylinder down the length of the tank, we force it to move with this oscillatory motion in both X and Y. We have the cylinder mounted to a 6-axis force sensor, so we measure forces as we do this. We also do flow visualization. So for a subset, for about 1,000 of the 10,000 experiments that we run, we do flow visualization. So we use a particle image velocimetry system to measure what the fluid is doing, to make a quantitative measurement of the fluid velocity field. If for those of you not familiar with particle image velocimetry, that works by shining a laser sheet through the fluid, and we seed the fluid with particles. The laser sheet illuminates those particles, and we take pictures of them over time with a camera, which then allows us to calculate what the velocity field looks like. So this just shows kind of our experimental setup from these 2 different views. Everything's completely automated, so we can actually set up our experiments to run. We'll run a single experiment. The whole system will reset. It waits about 8 minutes to let the tank settle down, the fluid in the tank settle down, and then it runs the next experiment. And so we can run these experiments continuously. And actually, Erdem, who was the grad student who ran these, ran them continuously for about a month and a half to run all 10,000 experiments that we did. So just to, it can be a little bit confusing when we try to present this data, because we're presenting, we're varying 4 variables, and then we also want to plot whatever our output measurement is. So to do this, the way we do this, we're using, I'll show a number of these plots. We use these polar plots to help show what's going on. So this polar plot shows variation of the phase theta around the polar plot. So that's the angles that are shown here. variation of the reduced velocity is shown across the, on the radius of each of these. So it starts with 4 at the center, moves out to 8. And then whatever we're plotting, so if I want to plot a lift coefficient, for example, that's shown as the contours or the colors in the plot. And then I can plot a separate polar plot for fixed values of the inline and cross flow amplitudes. So then I have to make multiple of these plots to show how a particular parameter varies throughout the entire database. So for example, if I want to show power coefficient and excitation, so the power coefficient is defined up in the top right here. It's basically the inner product of the force of the forces acting on the cylinder in phase with the velocity normalized by the fluid power. This is important because it shows where natural excitation of the structure would occur, or where energy transfer from the fluid to the structure, or from the structure to the fluid would occur. Where this parameter is positive is where there's excitation from the fluid to the structure. So that would cause vibrations to happen. Where this parameter is negative is where the structure is forcing the fluid. That would cause damping to the vibration of the structure. All right, so we can illustrate the entire database here and show where it's negative is just shown here in gray, where it's positive is shown in white. So every white region here is where we would have, where we would expect like free vibration of a structure to occur, of just a cylinder mounted on springs. And so the kinematic conditions for that happening would correspond to those shown in the plot here. So each of these, this matrix of plots is showing combinations of Y amplitude on the vertical axis, X amplitude on the horizontal axis, and then the specific values of the reduced velocity and the phase between motions within the polar plot. All right, so we can see there's a variety of kinematic conditions where excitation might occur, where this white region is. Now, we can also look at individual fluid forces. So if we look at the individual fluid forces, it's complicated. It's not particularly important to look at the specific values, but you can see from these plots, there's a pretty wide range to the values, to the excitation force CLV between -5 and 2.5 here. And the force in phase with velocity, there's a pretty large range to it as well. But one thing that we did notice when looking at these plots is there's a couple interesting regions where some weird stuff is happening. So if we look at these two particular cases here, for some of the phases, there seems to be some jumping around in the fluid force. And it's a little bit hard to see with the full plot here. So if we zoom in on one of these polar plots, we can see that for a phase near around between -120 and -150, we can see these kind of spikes in the force here where it's spiking back and forth. And so if we actually take a look at the plot where I plot along the ray of each of these polar plots, then basically we're plotting the lift in phase with acceleration as a function of reduced velocity for all different phases. Then we can see here from this plot, normally you follow a fairly smooth looking curve where there's a nice transition of this force coefficient as a function of frequency. However, there's a couple of these phases where we see the force coefficient kind of jump around, and it looks like it's actually jumping between multiple values here. And so it's interesting what exactly is going on here. Well, if we take a closer look at those values and we separate the values that are occurring over the high values that are being measured and the values that are occurring over the low values, then actually what's happening here is we're observing two separate branches to the fluid force. So if we take another look at this polar plot and we separate the upper branch from the lower branch, you can see that on the polar plot, there's actually an overlapping region where you have a particular fluid force associated with some aspect of the wake of the system. And for the exact same kinematic motions, you can have a different response of the system or a different wake. And this is exactly the type of thing that was happening in the Morrison-Williamson case that I showed earlier. So in order to really see what's happening here, you have to look at the wake itself. So we'll take a look at these two particular points, which are particular points that are along these different branches. So if we look at branch 1, which is the lower branch that was in the polar plot that's shown in the lower left here, and we look at what's happening in the wake for that particular kinematic condition, what we see is that we get these multiple vortices that are shedding in the wake. You get 2 vortices that are like-signed that shed together, and then they kind of spin up together in the wake. And then you get 2 of the opposite signed vortices that shed together and spin together. This type of a wake is what's called a 2C wake. It stands for 2 co-rotating pairs of vortices. It's actually similar to the 2S wake, where you have 2 single vortices that are shed, because if these vortices were to coalesce together, you would just have a single blue vortex or a single orange vortex shedding from the body. So this is interesting in itself, but if we take a look at what's happening on the other branch, we can see now if we jump up to the other branch, here we have very similar, almost exactly the same kinematic conditions to the lower branch. We have now what's called a 2P wake, where we have these pairs of opposite signed vortices that shed per cycle. And it's actually a bit different from the other wake, but if you look closely, it's a little bit related to what we had before, just that the vortices that are like-signed are spread a lot further out from one another. And because of that, again, the relative motion of the body with respect to these vortices shedding in the wake is very different. And because of that, you end up with different forcing and different forces and different phasing between the forces, which is why these responses end up on different branches when we look at them in the context of the force acting on the body. All right. So all of those wakes were for this case of minus 120 degrees here. If we actually just move along the plot a little bit away from that, if we move towards minus 60 degrees, we actually see that the wake transitions to what's called a 2S wake. It's just this classic Kármán vortex street where you have alternating shedding vortices in the wake. So that shows that there's actually a smooth transition of the wake, which is associated with this orbital motion of the body, or the orbital shape of the body when it undergoes these types of vibrations. Similarly, if I move in the other direction, if I move over to minus 180 degrees and keep all other kinematic parameters the same, what you end up with is a wake that's verging on a P plus S wake. So here you have 2 vortices. You have 2 of these blue vortices, for example, shedding in the wake of the body, 1 strong orange vortex shedding in the wake of the body. And then you also see this very weak orange vortex structure shedding in the wake of the body. So this is actually kind of a transition from what we saw before, where it was kind of the 2P pattern, where all of these vortices were roughly the same magnitude. And it's transitioning where one of these has become a lot weaker. So again, we see that there's a smooth transition if we move away from that particular kinematic condition. If we look at the other case, so the other case was slightly higher amplitude motions of the body. Again, we have this multi-branch region that we can separate apart. And if we plot the polar plot and look at it in a 3D view, again, we can see where these overlapping branches occur. And if we again go look at the wake, so we'll look at the wake for these two conditions, which are on two different branches again. If we're on the lower branch, where we have a negative lift in phase with acceleration, we get this really messy looking wake. So there's a lot going on here. It's incredibly messy. It's not well organized. There's a lot of vorticity that's being shed, and it kind of blobs up and then maybe separates apart. So you sometimes have pairs almost forming. Because of this messy wake, it causes a lot of asymmetry to the wake, and you end up with a mean lift force acting on the body for motions like this. If I switch to the upper branch response, so now we're looking at the same kinematic conditions, but now if we're on the upper branch condition, or the upper branch case, then we see a more well-formed wake where we see these regular vortical structures forming in the wake. It's almost what you would call a 2T wake, because you end up with kind of a triplet of vortices that shed each time. There's one weak orange vortex and two strong blues, then two strong orange with one weak blue. Again, this is interesting where the reformation of the wake results in this change in the phasing of forcing and this dramatic change in forces acting on the body. All right, and if we go through the entire database and we say, okay, where is this happening? All of these shaded regions on this entire map are regions where we observe this to happen. Now, one thing that's important to note is we're conducting towing tank experiments here. And actually, it's really hard to observe something like this in a towing tank experiment, because usually when you conduct an experiment, there's some sort of bias to your experiment. And what that'll do is it'll tend to bias your system to always show you the same response or the same wake. So this is kind of a testament to the nice way that this experiment was conducted. Because we made it completely robotic, we were able to repeat the experiment with the exact same conditions every time. And because there's no preference to the fluid on which of these wakes are going to form, it would naturally just switch between them. And so as we conducted a new experiment, it was completely random whether it would show one response or one of the wake branches or one of the others. Also, because of that, because we were running so many experiments here, the only experiments that we repeated were experiments for phases of minus 180 degrees. We actually ran them twice and repeated those, but none of the other experiments were repeated. But we did find that where these branch responses occurred for minus 180 degrees, such as in this case here, we did repeatedly produce these results where some of the time we would observe one type of wake and some of the time we would observe a different type of wake. So the interesting takeaway here is that this type of very nonlinear response is all over the place when you include this inline motion to the response of the system. Another aspect of this is because of these multiple wakes and where you get these very messy types of wakes, you can have some pretty strong mean lift regions. Mean lift can cause problems on offshore structures because you can get conditions of what's called kiting, where the structure will bias to one side due to the mean lift acting on it. Mean lift can also be, since it's a result of asymmetry, it can also cause or result in unstable vibrations such as galloping. I know I talked about modes a little bit, and kind of the classic wake modes in fluids are these, what we call the 2S pattern. They come from a paper from Williamson and Roshko from 1988. The classic modes are 2s, where you have 2 shedding vortices per cycle, 2p, where you have 4 vortices per cycle in pairs, or p plus s, where you have a pair plus a single vortex. Or you could also have a single pair, 2c we saw before as these 2 co-rotating pairs, or 2t we saw before as 2 triplets shed per cycle. The interesting thing we see is if we go through the entire database, we get all of these different modes and more. So it's really complicated. It's really complex what's going on in the wake of this structure, even with these minor and small variations to the kinematics of the structure. So this kind of, this illustration kind of maps out how there's so much variability in what's happening in the wake with these different types of wake modes occurring. So just try to illustrate the variability of the problem. So to kind of conclude, I know like I've kind of thrown a lot of information at you guys, but ultimately the reason for doing this is kind of the basis for developing new force models that could be used for predicting these types of motions. And if we want to go into applications where we want to predict motions of these types of fluid structure interactions, it's important to have these types of models available. So in the case of the force database or force measurements, it is important to have sufficient resolution when you're studying a problem like this, because some of these important dynamics may be lost. In fact, previously I had done some forced motion experiments like this, which with a much coarser measurement, and what we found was that in that case, we didn't observe any of these multiple branch regions in the force measurements. And the reason was that we didn't have enough resolution of the reduced velocity in the phase to be able to observe them. In observing these branches, this is pretty interesting. Although it has been observed in the past for cross-flow motion only, or 1 degree of freedom systems, the fact that it's so widespread when you introduce inline motion to the structure, that actually it aids in seeing the complexity to this particular problem. And it can actually pose a problem if we want to develop simple force models for this because of that non-uniqueness. So for instance, if you wanted to train like a machine learning problem to solve for you what the forces should look like under certain kinematic conditions, if you have 2 possible forces for a single kinematic condition, you have to feed in additional information, such as, for example, what direction you're approaching from, in order to define those things. And again, in the wakes, we saw there's a lot of wake variability, and the different wakes correspond to these different branch regions. Just to let you guys know, in future work, we plan to all of that visualization work that was done and characterization, that was done by myself and the 2 students that were mentioned here, Erdem and Dennis, where we went through all 1,000 flow visualizations in order to characterize them. The reason for doing that is even if we want to use more sophisticated identification techniques in the future, we have to have some reference to work from. So this is that's some future work that we'd like to look into in terms of being able to characterize or predict what the wake will look like under certain kinematic conditions. So that kind of concludes my presentation, and I hope that you guys hung in there and understood what was going on. And I hope maybe this was a break from what you maybe usually see. So I'd be happy to answer questions if you have any, or if there's time remaining.
Hi, Jason. This is Pedro Monaco. I put a couple of questions for you in the chat.
Oh, okay.
I know the answer is not like 3 minutes or so, whatever we have remained. But it's just like very interesting. Thank you for your presentation. Maybe we have the opportunity to talk more in detail of your work. Is really fascinating, I think.
Oh, sure. So you're asking, how accurate is the assumption of moving the cylinder in stagnant water instead of an underlying current in a fixed cylinder? The case of moving it in, because we're measuring hydrodynamic forces, the case of moving it when it's in still water and towing it through the fluid, it's actually a more pure measurement because we don't have any underlying turbulence in the background. If anytime you, so the other case is like for Williamson and for Morse and Williamson, in conducting it in a recirculating flow channel, you have some inherent turbulence background, which can also contribute to biasing what happens in the wake. So that could force the system to, bias itself to reform the wake in a particular form. Whereas by having the still fluid, in this case, that we're not biasing the system at all. Now, some people argue, well, how long is long enough to wait between experiments to make sure that the fluid's completely still? That's certainly an argument that you can have because, you could say there may be too long that you can wait because you might start to set up, if you have any like temperature gradient in your lab, you could set up a buoyancy current or something like that in your tank, which could bias the experiments. So we don't have any way of characterizing that right now in this particular data set. And the motion of the cylinder and the flow velocity are prescribed and fixed while the forces are being measured. Yes, that's correct. So in these experiments, we are prescribing the motion of the body and just measuring the force acting on the body. And theoretically, if the body was flexibly mounted and moving with the exact same motion that we prescribe, then just based on physics, the hydrodynamic force acting on the body should be exactly the same.
Okay.
Yes, he also asks, is it possible to impose the flow and simply allow the cylinder to respond to the vortex shedding? Yes, so that's exactly what happened in the very first video that I showed. That was just a flexible cylinder vibrating under the current, the incoming current. And that's what usually happens on offshore structures, why they vibrate. So Curtis asks, was your vertical motion always prescribed with the same initial direction of motion? Yes. So the Y motion was always prescribed with the same initial direction of motion. But
I have a quick follow-up question with that. Yeah. Have you ever tried beginning your motion from the opposite side of the stroke? I've been doing some forced oscillation experiments of not a cylinder and not with 2 degrees of freedom, but I found one particular narrow region of my experiments that had some sort of kind of force branching like what you were seeing, but it could be kicked one way or the other depending on that initial direction of motion.
Okay. Yeah, we did not try that, although in varying, when we vary the inline motion, because we're varying it as a function of that phase parameter, that theta parameter, that can actually cause the inline motion to have a switch in its initial motion. So although the Y motion is always going in the same direction, the X motion was switching depending on the phase that we were running.
Gotcha. Okay,
but
it's kind of wild to think about all the different variables that you have there. Very cool.
All right.
I'll jump in with a question if it's all right. To what extent does turbulence in the fluid, existing turbulence in the fluid, affect the validity or repeatability of and what were the turbulence conditions in the flume?
So turbulence can certainly affect the formation of the wake and the resulting fluid forces that you measure. In our case, we were conducting the experiments in a tank, not a flume. So the water was perfectly still when we start the experiment. And we wait, the total run time of an individual's experiment was about 10 minutes. So we'd start the experiment, it would tow down the length of the tank, it would reset, and then it'd be sitting there for about 8 minutes until it started conducting the next experiment.
Gotcha. And is there a general, would there be an expectation that if the fluid has turbulence that it would move the sort of the boundaries of the different vortex streets to lower velocities or to different lower, I don't know if there would be a frequency component.
Yes, I mean, certainly for the different kinematic runs, the kinematics of the different runs, if you have like a higher frequency run, you create more of a disturbance in the wake as opposed to the lower frequency where you'd just be, where it's, as opposed to doing this, you're stretching it out a lot more over the wake. So certainly the higher frequency cases would either require more time or potentially have more turbulence in the fluid under those conditions.
Thanks, and sorry I don't have more articulate questions.
It's okay.
Hi.
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just had a question. This is a great talk. I was wondering, forgive me if I missed this. On those polar curves, so you only ran experiments on the 30-degree markers, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so for like the plots that were fully colored for all the different parameters, how did you interpolate between those values, especially like the one that you showed with the like oscillating, like the different branches? How did you interpolate to get those results in between those measurements?
So that, I mean, the interpolation there is just done through, we're just using like a linear interpolation in MATLAB in order to smooth out the curve.
Okay.
So we start with the data points that we have, and we just do a linear interpolation between the data points to generate a smooth contour plot.
Okay.
So the jumping back and forth is really there because that's a result of the actual data points that we've measured.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, but thank you so much, Jason. I know I really enjoyed it, and I think others did as well. And your presentation is going to be available to us, correct? Or
I think were you recording?
Yeah, perfect.
I think you have a recording of it, but I can pass you the slides too.